Okay, so it's a little after 5:30. I will call the joint work session of the Oregon City Commission and the Oregon City Planning Commission to order for Tuesday, December 12th, 2017. Rather than roll call, we're just going to go around the room and introduce ourselves, starting with you, Commissioner Mabee.
Damon Mabee, Planning Commission.
Zach Henkin, Planning Commission.
Frank O'Donnell, City Commissioner.
Denise McGriff, Planning Commissioner.
Brian Shaw, City Commissioner.
Dan Holliday, Mayor.
Vern Johnson's Planning Commission.
Renata Mengelberg, City Commission.
Bob Mahoney, on my way out.
Nancy Ide, City Commission.
Okay. So before we get into the discussion item on alternative mobility, I have a couple of comments. One, the City Commission, I think at our last regular meeting, passed an addendum, or we changed the meeting policy for all the city boards and commissions. So as of today, the meetings must end by 10 o'clock, and if they are not ready to end by 10 o'clock, there has to be a unanimous vote of whatever board or commission it is in order to extend the time, and absolute terminus is 11 o'clock. It's my opinion that good decisions are not made after 11 o'clock at night when people have worked all day and done other things. So we need to plan our meetings accordingly. We need to run our meetings efficiently. And so I'm just letting everybody know that that's the case. We'll be letting the other boards and commissions know as we move forward. The other comment I want to make is that I was dismayed at the Planning Commission's decision on the Wheeler Tree Farm. And given that there was a lot of legalese and testimony, and there were tons of folks that came and testified, that doesn't negate our responsibility to follow the code when we make decisions. And that's why it was so difficult for, the City Commission hates to overturn the Planning Commission. It's not something that we take lightly. But at the same time, it was pretty clear to everybody that that decision was based on not so much fact as feeling. And so yesterday when we were taking planning commissioner candidates, I asked a question. I said, if something comes before you at the planning commission that you personally don't like or have an issue with, can you set aside your bias and make a decision based on the code and the law? And every single person said yes. If there's a current planning commissioner that can't do that, then you need to come talk to us, and we need to figure out what we're going to do, because the fact is that the law is the way the law is. We've written the code. If the planning commission wants to recommend changes to the code, please do so. Send them up. Let's talk about it. In fact, one of the things that we're talking about in the City Commission work session tonight is the lot averaging situation. But at the same time, you can't let your own personal bias get in the way of making decisions that are based on how the code is written. So I just wanted to say that, and we'll move on to the Alternative Mobility Targets Project for 213 Corridor, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mayor and Planning Commissioners and City Commissioners for getting together. I was just noticing that we don't get together as a group that often, so I just want to acknowledge the fact that we're doing that. We thought early on in the project we established some of our public involvement planning for this project, and this was one meeting of many, but this was one important meeting that we wanted to get to you. The work on the alternate mobility studies isn't done yet, but we're getting very, very close, and so it is a good time to bring the two groups together to give you an update and to acknowledge the work that's already been done. So this has been a collaborative effort between Oregon City as well as other jurisdictions, ODOT, the county, TriMet, Metro. There's been a lot of involvement, and all that effort's been led through our consultant Kittleson and Associates. And Susie Wright is really the commander-in-chief of the whole operation, right? So she's going to do this presentation for you tonight. She's got 32 slides to get through. The idea is to give you an update because some of you may not have heard any of this information, even though I think both the Planning Commission and City Commission have. No, we have city commissioners? Yes, Renata's been sitting in on the community advisory group, and so you're going to go through that in great detail. I guess the idea for tonight would be to get as much feedback and questions from you tonight as possible, so that during the public hearing process, because I think that's the next time it'll come before the Planning Commission next, right? After a couple meetings we're going to have with our technical groups, but kind of get that out now so that we can, because they may be questions that we can't answer tonight. So if we can't answer them tonight, we'd rather not have that situation happen in the hearing process. So, engaged conversation. I think you're open to interruptions, aren't you, Susie?
Definitely.
Okay, great. So with that, Susie Wright with Kittleson and Associates.
Great. Thank you, John. So, for the record, my name is Susie Wright. I'm with a company called Kittleson and Associates. With our offices are, I don't have my new address memorized. We just moved this weekend, but we're in Portland, Oregon. And I've had the pleasure of working with your staff over the last 6-9 months or so, and in particularly working with Dana Webb from city staff, kind of co-leading this project with her. So there are about 30 slides. We wanted to strike the right balance tonight between giving you guys some good technical information and background. Unfortunately, we have both a city commissioner and a planning commissioner who've participated with us in this process, and I'm hopeful that they can weigh in and provide some commentary as well. So our goal is to provide enough details that when this comes, you can give us some direction if there's any questions or things to address before. Ultimately, this plan will come back to both the Planning Commission and the City Council for adoption. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background on the project objectives. So when the city's TSP was updated in 2013, it really found that this corridor, there was not a solution for this intersection or this corridor, Highway 213, from basically I-205 area, Redland Road through Beaver Creek Road. The TSP identified that there's issues at in this corridor, and not necessarily a financially constrained solution to address the issues. So the TSP right now just identifies that we have an issue at this location, and the city needs to work with its other agency partners and internally to come up with an alternative mobility target, a way by which we would kind of monitor the long-term operations at the intersection. In particular, it's the transportation side of how we evaluate land use applications in particular. So the Oregon Highway Plan basically defines the state's kind of policies and investment strategies for the next 20 years. This 213 is an ODOT facility, but yet ODOT really leaves that responsibility to identifying projects and alternatives for corridors to local agencies and their TSPs. And they have said, identified a mobility target that they would like to see upheld on their facilities, and that if there's going to be a change to that, it really needs to, it ends up being an amendment to the Oregon Highway Plan. So the changes that we're talking about would need to be adopted locally, but also done in partnership with ODOT to amend the Oregon Highway Plan. So our objectives with this project were to see if there are do a more in-depth alternatives analysis at this location, kind of focused in a little more detail than at one location than you're typically able to get to within a transportation system plan update. So we wanted to relook at this location and see if there are any feasible alternatives or improvements that might meet the existing mobility target, and then identify whether an alternative target is necessary, and then if so, what would be a recommended new target. So a little bit of additional background policy. This is a regional facility with a lot of regional traffic through it. The improvements to fully address it would really need regional financial support to be cost feasible. Oregon City currently has an obligation, kind of through the adoption of their TSP, to come up with an alternative mobility target for this intersection that's stated in the city's TSP. That accepting a higher level of congestion at this location will allow the city to continue both looking for funding for a long-term solution, but while also allowing the implementation of concept plans that the city's completed. So our project was influenced by two groups. We had a community advisory group, which their job was to provide advice and guidance to staff and ultimately make a recommendation to you. Here's a kind of summary of all the folks who were included in the community advisory group. Tried to get kind of all modes and interests involved, as well as some geographic diversity. Our technical advisory committee was also advisory to us, providing staff guidance and in some instances kind of making some recommendations for consideration to the community advisory group on what was feasible and what was not. Here's a summary of that membership. As John indicated, we had participation from ODOT and the county and TriMet. So we met with both the technical advisory group and the community advisory group 3 times, starting back last December, and then again in March, and our most recent meeting in April. It was a 3-step process, really kind of bringing the groups up to speed with the project background and what the purpose of the project was, and really discussing that alternatives analysis and taking another look of, is there anything feasible, both from a cost standpoint as well as looking at other types of impacts that should be investigated further. Our second meeting, we really started talking about if we were going to move to a different type of mobility target, what were some of our options. And then in our third meeting, we brought those two pieces together to look at a kind of a combination of some lower cost improvements that were more feasible, could be amended into the city's cost constrained element of their transportation system plan, and partnering that with an amendment or an updated alternative, updated mobility target for the intersections. So diving a little bit into our first meeting, as I said, we gave them a lot of project background, existing conditions, not just on traffic operations and safety, but some of the physical constraints at the intersection of particularly Beaver Creek and Oregon 213 with culverts, steep slopes, wetlands. And we started a discussion of alternatives. So to recap what's in the city's TSP currently, at the 2 primary intersections that we're focused on along 213, which is at Beaver Creek Road and then at Redland Road. So currently in the TSP, there's not a improvement that increases capacity or help move more vehicles through the intersection. There are a couple improvements in the TSP at that location, however. One was to extend the left turn lane storage, which has been completed, and the other project which has not been completed is a safety improvement to provide advanced warning lights for the southbound movement, which is the movement coming from I-205 towards Beaver Creek Road. So there's no identified improvement to really address the capacity issue that is identified in the TSP. At Redland Road, there is a project that is forecast to meet the needs at Redland Road and 213, and that is what we're calling kind of phase 2 of the jug handle project. The jug handle project had improvements that extended through Redland Road, providing 3 through lanes in each direction. I have another slide on that. So that project is in the TSP. It's identified as approximately $10 million, and it's not in the cost-constrained side of the city's TSP. It's still in there as envisioned project, but not envisioned to be feasible over the horizon of the TSP with existing funding sources. So as part of because there was an identified solution at Redland Road in the TSP, our alternatives analysis really focused in at the Beaver Creek Road intersection to see what other options might exist. We looked at several at-grade options to improve the intersection. including additional left turn lanes, some rather different or innovative treatments that called displaced left turns. And then we also looked at several interchange forms to see what the different impacts and benefits might be. This represents a matrix kind of our evaluation process where we were not only looking at in that first colored column of kind of how much additional capacity would this improvement get us, but does it have impacts to right-of-way, needing to purchase right-of-way? Does it have an environmental impact, impacts to bicycles and pedestrians? What's the approximate range of the costs? And does it eliminate movements, start kind of restricting some of the things that you can do at the intersection, such as, not turn left, but need to make that left turn somewhere else. So green is all in all a good evaluation. Yellow is kind of minor impacts, and red is pretty severe impacts. So what we found was that nearly all of the improvements, even the lower cost ones, were still in a pretty sizable price tag of $5 million and up. But some of them did provide some significant operational benefit. Coming out of that first meeting set, what our technical advisory group recommended was that, that they did not believe the interchange alternatives to be financially feasible as far as looking at regional partnership for funding. They had concerns about some of the at-grade alternatives, and that they really would like to see additional safety safety improvements, as well as some more minor capacity improvements that might not solve the whole issue, but would provide some relief. And then this community advisory group basically said, of those at-grade alternatives, we would be interested in continuing to look at the triple left alternative as well as the displaced left, interested in keeping interchange on the kind of table and under consideration for the long-term future, and to make sure that we were including ODOT and county at future community group meetings. So then we went back to work, and then we came back to meet with our groups a second time. We came back and talked a little bit more about mobility targets and what the value benefit of each of the improvements provided. And we talked about what are some alternative ways to evaluate the intersection if mobility, a traditional volume to capacity target, isn't the best way. What are some of the lower cost feasible safety and capacity improvements? And we had a discussion about transportation funding. So as mobility targets, I'm using, you've heard me say volume to capacity ratio. That is the type of measure that is the mobility target is set on. It's what we use to assess existing and forecast kind of operations on a roadway. This measure really impacts land use and transportation planning as well as development review, and it helps guide decisions that get made. So the existing mobility target at the intersection of Oregon 213 and Beaver Creek Road is 0.99 during the first and second highest hours of the day, which is usually about,
So for the purposes of the folks at TV land, what is VC?
Volume to capacity.
Okay.
So it's a ratio of how many cars, that's the volume, might be going through an intersection during a 1 hour period, divided by the capacity, which is a theoretical number of how many cars theoretically could go through that intersection in an hour based on how big it is. So as you approach 1.0, you're kind of at the maximum number of cars that intersection's running as efficiently as possible, and you're kind of approaching the maximum that can go through in an hour. So Redland Road has a slightly different volume to capacity ratio. It is 1.1, which is kind of over capacity during that peak hour, and then lowering to 0.99 during the second highest hour of the day. And that has a different existing standard based on it being considered part of a regional center. So in regional centers, the regional plan has identified accepting higher levels of congestion in the planning horizon for the peak hour, recognizing that they're the purpose of regional centers is to have higher densities. So what's currently in the city's TSP? So because these two intersections in the cost-constrained plan don't meet the current mobility target. The city's TSP identifies that they shall come up with an alternative mobility target, and that for the time being, the city's code states that properties that are zoned outright do not need to meet the standards at these two intersections. However, zone changes and plan amendments do need to meet these standards. So therefore, kind of we're at a little bit of an impasse right now in being able to consider zone changes until an agreed upon mobility target is adopted. So in coming up with an alternative mobility target, we looked at a variety of different potential measures that we could use. Volume to capacity is the one that's being used currently, and we went through a lot of analysis and discussion with the advisory groups, pros and cons of different types of measures, and looked at travel time data and safety data, and ultimately came up with a recommendation to stick to the measure of volume to capacity ratio, but we would be looking at kind of changing that benchmark, but sticking with the actual measure of volume to capacity ratio. We had started a discussion about, okay, if we are going to have a different target, can we look at both implementing some improvements at the same time as amending the standard, and what should go in the TSP and what's feasible to make financially constrained. So these two things need to go kind of hand in hand. It's kind of we're going to say we are going to change the standard to accept a little bit higher levels of congestion or a higher VC standard, but we are also at the same time going to be providing improvements that are going to provide some relief, and I'll get into that a little bit more, as well as providing some safety improvements. The committees asked us to look at a number of low-cost improvements, from increasing the that would help safety as well as congestion, red light cameras, increasing the shoulder width, improving the lighting. The medium cost improvements that would have some capacity benefit, they asked us to look closer at, were providing a westbound to northbound right turn merge lane, and that's what you have probably seen in our draft report, and I'll talk a little bit more about, was the main improvement that advanced forward for consideration. That right turn lane provides significant congestion relief during the AM peak hours, and some during the PM peak hours. So it's providing helping reduce the total hours each day that people are experiencing congestion, even if it's not fully meeting the existing standard. So we had a little bit of a discussion about funding. Our committees really wanted to understand, our community advisory group in particular, how come we couldn't adopt one of these higher cost improvements into the TSP, and basically said, well, we have a lot of unfunded improvements in the TSP. We could put a higher cost improvement back in the TSP. We have one at Redland Road, but fundamentally the issue is making it cost constrained, so that we've, the city currently has about $98 million of unfunded need in the TSP currently. And as we looked at the current rate of SDCs is about $8,800 per dwelling unit, and we went through some exercises of, saying if you wanted to, add a multi-million-dollar improvement to the TSP and make sure that it was cost constrained, we talked through some scenarios of what that meant on a per household rate for the SDCs, and ultimately there's agreement that that's a major improvement at this intersection is of regional scale, and it would be very, unfair to put that burden just on the local residents or in Oregon City, when the majority of the traffic through that intersection, as well as a certain portion of the growth, is not local. So it was not a fair burden to the city's SDC rate. So in kind of summary from meeting number 2, there was kind of agreement that the city was not and should not fund a major improvement all on its own at this intersection, but they needed to move forward with the obligation to identify an alternative mobility target, that we can implement both an alternative target as well as move forward some of the more financially feasible improvements while still working towards identifying a long-term solution that for the time being may be considered unfunded. That there was definite interest in the community in continuing to try to identify what that long-term solution is, and similar to the situation that exists at 213 and Redland Road with the Jug Handle Phase 2 project. So the recommendations for our work moving forward were to identify the cost feasible improvement, that figure out from a cost standpoint, so look at some of these improvements and figure out what is feasible, and recognize the community's desire for a long-term solution. Make sure that as we were looking at safety improvements, we were making sure that we could identify some improvements that would offset increased safety risks from increased traffic. And the direction on the mobility target was to stick with the volume to capacity ratio measure, but allow that standard, which today was 0.99 and 1.0 respectively at the 2 intersections. Let's stick with that basically as a standard, but allow a certain number of hours per day to be exceeded. So then we went forward trying to refine what those improvements were that could be incorporated into the TSP, and really work to refine exactly the language for the proposed target. As we started looking closer at the improvements, so this is the right turn merge lane at Beaver Creek in 213. Let's see, do I have a red dot here? Yes. So, the right turn merge lane, so this is the right turn lane that exists today to get you from Beaver Creek Road to head towards I-205 on 213. So this right turn exists today, but what doesn't exist today, it looks like it exists here, but that's actually a shoulder. So what we're showing is converting that shoulder and providing some widening so that we can have a lane, exclusive lane for the right turn, and they have some time to accelerate and merge down here rather than merging right here and essentially having to have a green light to be able to make that turn, particularly in the morning. Because in the morning, that's when we were seeing the biggest, actually some of the worst operations at this intersection were in the morning. And this helps significantly improve the AM peak hour conditions. We also looked at and it's hard to see on this drawing, but we also looked at what can we do to improve some of the issues on actually Beaver Creek Road between 213 and Maple, because we understood that there's kind of queuing for people trying to turn from Beaver Creek to Maple that's spilling back here and causing some issues. So we did look at that it is physically possible and doesn't hurt intersection operations to, instead of having 2 left turn lanes from Beaver Creek Road here to head south towards Molalla on 213, if we reduce that down to a single left turn lane and reallocated that space to have more storage for the cars that want to turn on Maple, we basically found that that would not hurt operations at the 213 Beaver Creek Road intersection, but we are not necessarily recommending that as part of this package right now, but have said it really there needs to be some work done at the Beaver Creek and Maple Lane intersection. Essentially, we were not, basically said it should be considered in tandem with improvements at Beaver Creek and Maple Lane.
Susie, does that
Yes.
provide any kind of a problem where you try to make that left turn, and the closer you are queued back to that crosswalk, you come around the corner and it's queued back, all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's the issue today. So it's a very short left turn lane, and so people end up stopping in a through lane because they really want to turn left. So if we can increase the length of that left turn lane, we can kind of kind of reduce the frequency of incidents where somebody's turning left and they're finding somebody stopped here. So basically what we were able to say through our analysis is that this intersection, that doesn't have a negative impact and it's feasible. What our analysis didn't get into great detail looking at Maple Lane and Beaver Creek to really say, is that, you know, long enough? What would the signal phasing and the turn lanes need to be at Beaver Creek and Maple? That's why we've recommended that that concept still be considered in the future, but as you start looking in more detail at Beaver Creek and Maple Lane. But that it's not a, it wouldn't have a negative impact on this intersection per se. And then at 213 in Redland Road, so this is a drawing that really comes from the jug handle project. So this is the part of the jug, this is the jug handle that has been built. This exists, but when this project was designed, it was designed to extend all the way through the Redland Road intersection with 3 through lanes in each direction. So these plans exist, but this phase of the project is not funded, but it is in the city's TSP. So after that, our third meeting with the advisory groups, there was, you know, consensus as we talked about the SDCs and the regional partnership that would be needed for the improvements. The recommendation was that we did need to move forward with the alternative mobility target, that's sticking with a VC-based target, you know, exceeding some threshold for no more than a certain number of hours per day. And that would like to see the westbound, that right turn acceleration lane included in the cost-constrained TSP. And at Redland Road, same thing on the mobility target, sticking with the VC for a certain number of hours per day, and that to keep the phase 2 unfunded projects in the TSP. So there's been some work that's happened since our last meeting with the advisory groups to just really kind of refine the language of the mobility target and get to some agreement with ODOT on what that language is and exactly how many hours and how it's written, as well as to really fully vet the right turn merge, as well as some of the other enhancements that could be done at the intersection at the same time. So the city staff has been working with ODOT, as I mentioned, to look at the target. And as part of that, on a technical side, we agreed that instead of, we're going to stick with that volume to capacity ratio, but typically ODOT applies those standards for the peak season, and there was agreement that we would set a standard based on annual average conditions, which happened to be more of the May timeframe. So setting a standard based on annual average conditions rather than peak season, but still sticking with the volume to capacity ratio. But that definition of how many hours per day is it exceeding the standard is based on an annual average condition. ODOT also asked us to take a look at the queuing that might be happening at 213 and Redland Road to make sure that if we're adopting an alternative mobility target there, you know, they were wanting to know, is congestion there anticipated to cause queuing that would spill back to I-205? And we did take a look at that and said is not projected to impact the I-205 ramp terminals. So the staff looked at the TSP and tried to kind of hone in on exactly what the project descriptions would be, and have recommended additions to the TSP for project W for walking 83, Beaver Creek Road sidewalk infill to connect the Coltrane Path to north of Marjorie Lane, and adding project W84. Sorry, I said W is for walking, but I think that's I misspoke, because W84 would be the Highway 213 and Beaver Creek Road safety area improvements. So intersection enhancements that will be evaluated. So looking at raised crosswalks, bike lane striping through the intersection, ladder style crosswalks, lane narrowing, wayfinding signage, and buffered bike lanes, just really trying to enhance the safety of that intersection for pedestrians and cyclists. So the mobility target, and kind of refining in on exactly what that language is, the recommended mobility target is that during the first, second, and third hours, so for 3 hours, the 3 highest hours of the day, a maximum VC ratio of 1.0 be maintained at Beaver Creek Road, and calculating that based on annual average conditions. So what this graph highlights for you is the operations during the 5 highest hours of the day forecasted out in the TSP horizon year of actually this is 2040, I believe, which is kind of a little bit further out than your TSP, but wanting to be consistent with the next regional plan. What this shows is the top line, where you got 4 red boxes, that's the projected volume to capacity ratio during the 5 highest hours. That's without the right turn lane. And so you can really see that during the morning, that 5th highest hour, that right turn lane is having a very significant impact on the operations of the intersection. The second line is the projected VC ratios during the 5 highest hours of the day with that right turn lane. And you can see that it's having a tremendous benefit during the morning and a significant impact throughout the afternoon hours, such that we were able to recommend a mobility target that said during the peak 3 hours, so this 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, a VC ratio of 1.0 be maintained. And so this is the baseline that all future kind of plan amendments would be evaluated against. But anything that was considered as part of your TSP would not be an amendment, if that makes sense. And at Redland Road, this is the forecast for the 5 highest hours, and the recommendation for during the first and second highest hours, a VC ratio of 1.0, that's based on these being 1.0 and 1.09, and the third highest hour not exceeding 1.05. So that was kind of taking the advisory group's recommendations and then working them down more refined to language that was acceptable by ODOT, rather than us just saying we're not going to exceed 1.99 or 1.0 for more than 2 or 3 hours. They wanted to see this stair-stepped approach to be a little bit more refined. So in summary, the recommendations are to adopt an alternative mobility target at Beaver Creek Road for a maximum volume to capacity ratio of 1.0 for 3 hours a day based on annual average conditions, while also amending the TSP, the financially constrained list, to include the westbound right turn merge lane along with safety improvements and sidewalk infill. And then at the 213 Redland Road intersection, a recommendation to adopt the alternative mobility target for a maximum VC of 1.10 for 2 hours a day and 1.05 for the third hour based on annual average conditions. So the next steps for this moving forward, we are going to take, because I noted there'd been some additional work since our third advisory group meetings. We're going to go back to our advisory groups to bring them up to speed with the work that's been done since our last meeting. But for the most part, the recommendations are in the final report, are consistent with the direction that they gave us, but we want to share with them some of the refinements. And then that's all in preparation for a planning commission hearings tentatively scheduled for January 22nd, which would then they would make a recommendation to the City Commission with a tentative date of February 7th. And then from there, moving forward, we would need to work with ODOT to get that reflected in the Oregon Highway Plan. With that, I am open to questions.
Commissioner Shaw?
Well, I guess, thank you for all of that. It's, it's interesting to see it in writing, but I think we kind of all had a hunch what was going to have to happen there. But my question is probably more towards Laura about the Beaver Creek concept plan and that alternate road that was running across the back that was going to drop onto the 213. If we could maybe have a little explanation about that, because that could really help this intersection.
Laura Terway, Community Development Director for the City of Oregon City. There was a lot of communication with this project between multiple departments, and it did assume Myers Road connection between Beaver Creek and 213. It assumed the density, excuse me, within all of our concept plans. It assumes density within all of our annexation areas and our comprehensive plan designations. So that is a big thing that will help us alleviate congestion. Once we build Myers Road, there will be a different place that will hopefully alleviate congestion at Beaver Creek and 213.
So this is the one that is going from Beaver Creek Road over to the bypass. That's the one I'm talking, that back road that was
The Myers
proposed?
Road,
Is that what it's called?
right by the high school.
So there'd be an interchange on the bypass, on the 213 bypass, okay.
So in the TSP, it has an intersection right at Hagen's, or where there used to be Hagen's, right
Yes.
there, where Myers Road tees into
Right.
213. You'll be able to go straight across what looks like the college area,
Yeah.
and then connect over to Beaver Creek. And that was a really big help to alleviate congestion at this intersection.
So can we study that at all instead of kind of, I mean, we're just kind of putting Band-Aids on this thing. We know, we're going to run out of Band-Aids here pretty soon, so.
Well, bring out your checkbook.
So is there any way to push that forward at all or what here?
Now, that's a difficult thing about all of this in transportation planning, is that we know that we are tasked with coming up with a solution, and we have all these little things that we can't afford that make sense, and then we know we could build a grade-separated intersection for upwards of $50 million, and that'll fix the problem, but since we don't have the $50 million. So this project, in this project, we agree as a community that we'll accept more congestion in lieu of improvements for pedestrians and cyclists, and doing as many improvements around the network as we can, including parallel paths like Myers Road. It's a tough project.
Commissioner Maybe?
Yeah, first off, I don't know where you're talking, where you're talking about
Sit, Laura.
the W83. Where is that pedestrian connection? Coltrane Trail, what? Where is that? And maybe that's John.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that was the safety projects, right? That was the W83, wasn't that the one that was?
That was a sidewalk.
Oh, if it was a sidewalk, it was a project, so it would be, I guess it would be east, if we're thinking 213 is north and south
that's
here.
north, south, that's 213.
It's east, on the other side of Maple Lane, so it really would connect, sidewalk connection between Maple Lane and Coltrane is a cul-de-sac that doesn't actually intersect with Beaver Creek Road, but it gets close to Beaver Creek Road, so there's a pathway connection there.
Okay.
So it would really kind of just carry that.
So it's on the north side of Beaver Creek then, going from Maple Lane now.
It would be on the north side of Beaver Creek, yes.
All right, that's fine. I just didn't know where that was. I was like, because I just saw it tonight. And then for Susie, just to put it in the record, we did talk about the idea of adaptive signals at the intersection. I think there's a lot of dead time when turn signals are on and there's no cars in the queue. So the ability to maybe advance the lights to move that. And I think, just to pontificate, I think whoever came up with that right turn lane and cutting that one lane off is brilliant. But the other element of that is when you were looking at the buildup of traffic on Redland and 213, did you look at what the impact of having that right turn lane would do to the traffic buildup? Because if you have cars kind of constantly going through instead of a surge as each light changes, what would that do to the VC at the intersection at those times? Because you're going to take a lot of the surge out of the impact, and you might decrease the amount of cars going through. So do we need a 110 when maybe a 105 would be the more appropriate number?
That's a good question. I need to think about that a little bit.
Okay.
No thinking aloud.
So whether that right turn is going to basically help more traffic get to, more traffic get to Redland. Impact
In
operations at
more
Redland.
steady stream so that each light will have, say, 20 cars go through it instead of 5, 50, 5, because that's what builds it up is when you can't clear out that queue.
Yep.
And so will that, let things flow a little more smoother and maybe lower the VC. So that's.
Ms. Turway, so do we have projects that are currently on hold waiting for this to get finished?
We do.
How many?
We have approved some zone changes up in the Park Place area that have a condition that the zoning will not be applied until this is sorted out. And then we cannot implement the zoning for the Beaver Creek Road concept plan. We're working on an implementation project now to create the zoning. We can't apply it until this is done either.
So can we, I noticed the last step was getting the OTC to approve sometime summer, spring or summer. Can we move that closer to spring?
We're working as quickly as we can to get through the process. I think the curious thing with the OTC is that we're going to be the first alternate mobility project within the metro region before them. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there. So we want to make sure that we get it right and coordinate really well with them ahead of time. So we've been meeting with ODOT and the other districts who have alternate mobility targets, like Seaside and Sandy has one, to make sure that it's something that they will approve, because they could say, no, you can't allow more congestion. We want to have trucks be able to move on this highway. That's our main goal. So we think that we've hit a good compromise.
Okay.
But we're working as fast as we can.
Chief, could you come up for a second, please? Chief Band? Sorry, there was one thing in there that, do we have an issue with red light running and accidents at that intersection?
213 in Beaver Creek?
Yeah.
That is the most dangerous intersection in town statistically, and it is pretty significant compared to other regions. But it is not, the majority of those crashes are not angles. So somebody, two cars crossing, actually the majority of them are rear enders. And a lot of injury crashes, and it's mostly from that.
So red light cameras would not necessarily resolve the rear end question. In fact, generally speaking, don't red light cameras increase rear end accidents?
They can. We looked at this intersection specifically when we were researching red light cameras. For every article or study that you see talking about the benefits, you will find just as many finding problems with them. So we could not find any evidence clear enough that showed us that there would be any benefit. One of the other problems anywhere that you want to put red light cameras, if you're going, I cannot remember the time frame, but it is somewhere around 2 or 3 years. I think John might remember better than me, but if you're going to, in advance, before or after you want to put cameras in, if there's going to be a potential change within 2 or 3 years after, and if there was a change, you have to wait 2 or 3 years before you could even put a camera in to basically, so whatever change you make, they want to give it 2 or 3 years to see if it's going to work before you assess whether or not a camera would be an option.
Okay. Any other questions for the chief?
I have for the chief, real quick.
Okay, thanks, chief.
I actually have one for the chief.
Oh, okay,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Ben.
What, is there a big pedestrian issue at that intersection? Because I'll get what I'm getting at is, I think we've got 3 too many sidewalks at that intersection. I kind of think we should limit the sidewalks to just the south side of 213 on the Sherry's intersection. Because people don't need to be crossing there. They should be crossing at Fur, crossing at Sherry's, and crossing at Thayer. So is there an issue with people on the north side particularly crossing? I mean,
Well, so it's a good, not a traffic engineer or a person walking on the sidewalk engineer, but there is an argument about, will people walk just where a sidewalk is? There is a lot of foot traffic, as you know, there's a bus stop, a well-used one on the north side.
which could be moved.
Large apartment complex down there that is not as large as it used to be, but there is a lot of foot traffic there. And frankly, there's a lot of people living down in that canyon. And you see a lot of people walking northbound on that side. So I guess my fear would be if they weren't walking, if we removed a sidewalk, then I believe people would still be walking there.
Yeah, my concern is that they're, would be crossing the traffic. I understand there'd be people on the shoulder, but, the bus stop could be moved up closer to Fur, and then, because that's where the people are coming from, is out of that apartment complex to get it. And potentially another bus stop could be added around Thayer, and then there's no need for people to cross, because from Fur to 213, there's nothing there. That's the canyon. And so, it just seems like there's more crossings are more chances for conflict. And as long as that stretch is, it just seems like getting people channelized would be better. But you don't have any particular experience with that.
There is no problem that I'm aware of with auto versus pedestrian accidents. It's a busy intersection, so they do happen, but not in a way that I'm aware of that is any different than any other intersection.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
I guess the other thing I'd say, just if I could, is seems like everything that we're doing now is about making that pedestrian trip that much more available. And so the idea of eliminating just seems contrary to most of what we're doing throughout the rest of the city. And the other little piece I wanted to add is there's a corner there that's undeveloped that I think may have a pretty big potential for pedestrian trips as well. So I would hate to shorten that piece.
Commissioner Hyde.
Yeah, just real quick, I think this is for Ms. Turway. As far as the Park Place build-out, the rezone up there, so when that intersection is completed, it has to be planned before the development can begin. Is that correct? Rather than the intersection does not have to be built out. It just has to be in the plan. That's what I understood, because I just wanted that it didn't have to be built, but it had to be in the plan to be built.
And approved by the OTC. That's the big one.
I'll have to double check before I answer you.
Okay.
Regardless, we would want to measure, or we do measure, what the impact of that development is on that intersection, and that's where you start to get proportional improvements. Whether they're built or not, we can start collecting fees to pay for those.
Okay.
But I can get back to you with the answer.
But Laura, isn't it true that what we're held up with is the rezoning, right? So taking it from what it is in the county's zoning to what it would be in the city's zoning, so more of that R6, R8, those things can't happen until we get through this plan, which would then identify those projects and identify, at least in concept, how they'd be funded. So they don't have to be built, but and once they're rezoned, it's my understanding that they can be developed up until the point as they trigger something that would change that traffic number beyond what we've suggested is going to be adopted in the alternate mobility.
Yeah, they would analyze the traffic impacts when it comes in, and then I can grab Carrie up here too. You have a better recollection. We can get back to you on it.
That's okay.
We'll get you the right answer.
Commissioner Mahoney.
The one thing I see absent from this transportation planning is a well-grounded funding plan and strategy. We've identified the problem ad nauseum. We know what to do to get out of it design-wise. I mean, you hand an engineer a bucket full of money and he just starts to salivate because he'll build himself out of it. But we don't have that. We don't have a strategy and we don't have a means by which we can identify the source of the funding. And in my judgment, it's at the federal level. It's not the state. The state trips over itself trying to approve a $1 billion transportation system, and it's spread pretty thin. We're going to choke ourselves to death unless we solve this problem. This is serious stuff, because the growth and vitality of a community rests on its transportation system, just like our bodies. If we don't have blood flowing through our bodies, we're dead. Same thing with a city. If its transportation system isn't healthy and efficient and work, the city dies. But where's that money coming from? We don't have a strategy. We haven't identified where we're going to get that money. Where's that strategy going to come from? We're sitting at this table right now. We're going to have to take off the gloves, folks. We're going to have to take off our jackets and call some. There's a bunch of people running around this state having public open house meetings, and they're from the federal level. But I don't see them here talking about, we're going to get you some money to solve your problems.
That's because most of them are in the opposition at this point.
Well, that's fine, but we still got this local problem which people have to deal with. And we're going to talk this thing to death for the next 10 years, and we're going to be back here having the same information thrown at a different council, a different planning commission, and the problem's going to be the same, because we didn't get on board and say, let's roll up our sleeves and get a funding situation and ring the bell and get some attention going here and rattle somebody's cages, because money's going to solve this problem. What would you do if you had $500 million sitting in front of you? And it was, you can't spend it unless it's on transportation. Bam, problem solved. We don't have that.
Thanks, Commissioner.
And I didn't hear anybody mention it tonight. And, you know, I hate to be that guy in black hat, but.
No, you don't.
You're right, I don't.
Anybody else? Yes, I have a follow-up question.
Commissioner McGriff.
Yes, I want to follow up on something that Brian said. Basically, I think unfortunately we are putting a Band-Aid on it. I was trying to remember, because I wasn't here then, when 213 opened. And to echo what Bob said, we have talked this thing to death. So there's a couple of things that come to mind besides the fact that if we had been putting money away, all the affected jurisdictions, Clackamas County's been telling us for 30 years they don't have money. Oregon City's been saying for 30 years we don't have the money. So if we'd put money away back then when that opened and worked with the state, we would have the money now to probably build it because of inflation and so forth. So I think, Bob, you're right on the money that there has not been a funding strategy. And you're right, there's a Band-Aid. It's another Band-Aid. I'm not saying that the VC is not correct, but how do we get to, in your opinion, how do we get to a community consensus that we're going to accept more congestion? I hear John Lewis say this all the time. I don't hear that from the community. And we have to sit meeting after meeting after meeting, and guess what the biggest #1 complaint is? Starts with a T, ends with a C. I tell Chief Band this all the time, except I didn't tell him today. But that's the #1 complaint I hear from people who come to testify before us. I hear it from people in Fred Meyer. Doesn't matter where I am. That's the #1 complaint. So how, in your opinion, how do we get the community to understand that they need to accept more congestion? Because they're not there. They're not there. We've not done any work to educate them, to get them to understand how this works. They don't get it. They just know that they can't get from point A to point B when they want to, so then they speed all over town. Mm-hmm. So just give me your thoughts from an engineering standpoint.
Sure, I'm sorry, I can't tell who that question was directed at to me. So I mean, I don't have the long-standing kind of history of your, with your transportation system plan, but that is really the first place to have that conversation of not just at this intersection, but what are the full needs of the community? how much are you willing to, how much of those needs are you willing to fund? So one of my graphics kind of identified a kind of overview of how much is considered funded in the city's TSP versus unfunded. And as part of the discussions of the TSP, there was, and this is where I really do need John, having participated in that process, to weigh in, but it's through the transportation system plan that you really have that discussion with your community of, here's what's been in our plan, here's how much of that plan we can afford. Our funding, the financially constrained part of the TSP is funded primarily with SDCs, as well as some gas tax. The gas tax portion is small because the majority of gas tax that comes to the city goes to maintain your existing system. So that conversation of, where should the additional funds come from? One, it's through regional partnerships. Do you have a project that, ODOT and the county, is equally high priority for them? I think this kind of process and long-standing conversations in this area have shown that, this is not a top priority location for ODOT. So the question is, as a city, do you want to either amend your SDCs to increase them to be able to afford more transportation projects? I think the answer that I have heard is that, no, that's an unfair burden on addressing issues that are not, shouldn't be bared just by these new households. Or should we be looking at additional local funding sources? And I think that is something that a lot of local communities are having real conversations and actually implementing local gas taxes.
Commissioner Mahoney suggested tolls.
I would like to wait and see, how the tolling goes at the state level first.
Yes.
But I think ultimately that someday that will ultimately trickle down to the local level. I have no doubt. But so that, these are the kind of conversations that all communities are grappling with. And then you have to say, so are we as a community going to let, if everybody, are we going to build the community that we want, or are we going to, because we can't address, we locally can't address, the region's transportation problems, are we going to kind of stand still?
Maybe, Denise, I think for this project and for this particular topic, this process is what we've defined as how to get public buy-in. And as flawed as it probably is, trying to get folks to come to meetings to provide input and to provide the kind of guidance that these kinds of processes are set up for don't lend themselves to packed houses, unfortunately. I did what I thought was a pretty thorough update at our last TAC meeting specific to the Park Place neighborhood. And Bob asked that we kind of address the transportation issues associated with growth in the Park Place neighborhood. So put a lot of staff hours into trying to do that and provide information about accidents and what the real speed is, what the traffic counts are that we know based on our, every 3 years we measure traffic on various locations. And there was a handful maybe that showed up for that meeting and a couple who actually testified, but not what you would expect, especially given the effort that I know that the neighborhood did to try to reach out to folks to get feedback. Because when do they show up? They show up for that planning commission when they're proposing an annexation or a rezone or whatever, right? And then that happens once they realize it's their next door and they start knocking on doors and talking and getting one another all excited about this growth, right? It's kind of, for me, it was enlightening that we put that much effort in. It was also enlightening to see that the problems aren't quite the way people perceive them to be. I encourage folks that really have a problem with traffic in Oregon City to try another metro city, Tualatin, Sherwood even now, Beaverton. And you look at this particular intersection in comparison, there's there's seldom a time when you can't get through that in short order. And like the Redland 213 intersection, I know there has been times when we've seen backups there. I think that's more related to some of the things that you brought up with regard to smart signalization and is it programmed right and operating quite right. I think those things back up, or is it 205, because that's usually at Redland and 213. The problem is that we've got enough traffic standstill on 205 that people just assume that it's that one intersection when in fact it goes much further than that. So, I mean, to your question, Denise, I think this is the process. We're trying to do the best we can to get the community input. We've got a website, web page that's well developed. I didn't introduce Dana, but she has been the staff person on this, and she's done an excellent job of trying to float the word out there. And it's taken us longer on this process than we had planned. And I think that should inspire some, opportunity for folks to chime in again and provide us more information, but we just don't always hear it. And for me, part of it is it's not that bad. It's really not that bad.
Okay, so we're about 7 or 8 minutes over scheduled. Commissioner Henkin, you had a question?
Frank, you indicated on the terminal.
Oh, yeah. Did I push it?
I withdraw mine for sake of time.
Does anybody else have a question?
I have something, Dan. This is a bit off the wall, but it is a work session, so I'm going to ask it. It follows what John said, and it follows what Damon said with the sidewalks. I spent a lot of time in Seattle, and that's a nightmare. But one thing they do is they change the use of their lanes depending on the need to flow traffic in different direction. Was there any consideration given to, it seems like the focus here is on Beaver Creek westbound to 205 north. Is that where most of the solution lies? That's what it appeared to me. At least there's options there.
It's the opposite AM and PM, but yeah, those are the.
Could we do lane reallocation on different hours? For example, would it benefit us all to do a double right turn coming westbound on Beaver Creek on the 205 north at 7 in the morning and then reallocate that second right turn lane to go straight later with a system of gates and informational signs, or is that way too sophisticated?
They do it in Canada as well. Vancouver has it.
Do they?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not an option that we explored. Certainly could. It's semi-common on a highway or an expressway, not so much, once you get down to the arterial level, which I know 213 is an expressway, but you're in an area that's transitioning. But it's not something we looked at, but it's not somewhere that ODOT has gone on any of their facilities yet, but certainly something we could explore to see if there is feasibility. There was actually a very promising improvement. It was alternative 3. It was for it was called a displaced left turn. And I think it is an option that long-term the city should keep looking at and exploring with ODOT. ODOT wasn't ready to look at it as an option just yet, but I think it's an intersection type at grade, doesn't require a lot of structures, doesn't require a lot of right-of-way, but it includes building an advanced signal to help the left turns get on the other side of the street so that left turns and throughs can go all at the same time. So this might be a topic of another work session, but I think it has great promise. It provided as much capacity benefit as an interchange.
So you're talking about the same kind of system. So if you're westbound on Foster, going to 205, there's a one dedicated left turn light going on to 205 southbound, and then there's one light that is a green / arrow that allows you to go straight forward and left?
No, it's different than that. There's not anything in the Portland metro area, I think, that I could cite as an example.
Okay.
But it's a treatment that other states are using on their state facilities on corridors as intersection after intersection, and I think it's something here regionally. Eventually we'll gain some traction. But
okay. Any further questions?
Well, to clarify what I'm proposing, you'd be coming westbound on Beaver Creek. The informational sign as to how the lanes are going to be used would be back around Taco Bell or further back. In the morning, we would have a double right turn lane with that information provided, and as needed, we would gate off the second right turn lane and allow that traffic to flow straight on through Beaver Creek. Like I say, off the wall, but everything's up for grabs.
Okay. Then thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Thanks, Dana. And we will adjourn this meeting, and we're going to take about 5-6 minutes, and then we'll come back for the City Commission work session. I will convene the work session for the Oregon City Commission for December 12th, 2017. Call roll, please.
Commissioner Ide?
Aye.
Commissioner Shaw?
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Here.
Commissioner Mengelberg? Mayor Holliday?
Here. Full house tonight. That's
Yeah, no kidding.
Does anybody have any future agenda items they'd wish to put on the schedule? Hearing none, move forward. We're at 3A, PC 17-157, Willamette Falls Riverwalk Master Plan. Ms. Turway.
Thank you very much. Mr. Phil Lewis will give you a good introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. We're here today to discuss the Willamette Falls Riverwalk. We're excited to present the 2-year journey that has led to this point. During that time, we got to know the site and the community. We believe that the design integrates both into a vision for the future. We're here today to present our draft master plan document, which memorializes the planning process for the Riverwalk. This is an aspirational master plan document that anticipates future funding commitments, grants, and fundraising efforts. It is anticipated that the design of the Riverwalk will be built in phases as funding becomes available. Each phase of the project will be submitted for individual land use approval. As you are aware, we continue to work through current issues to ensure that the site ownership structure supports delivering the project and the 4 core values. Still, your approval of the master plan is an important step making the community's vision a reality. As the primary agency funding the draft master plan, the Metro Council preliminary reviewed the plan at a work session on November 21st, 2017, as it is and is anticipating public comments until December 13th, 2017. Metro Council anticipates adopting of the master plan by resolution in January of 2018. Staff will bring the master plan document forward for City Commission adoption by resolution in February of 2018. After a vote of support on the January 25th, 2017 PRAC meeting. We look forward to finishing the process alongside our partners and the public who have helped plan the future of the Riverwalk. Alex Gilbertson, Metro's Riverwalk Project Manager, is going to walk you through the draft plan. Alex.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Good evening, Mayor Holliday and Commissioners. My name is Alex Gilbertson. As Phil mentioned, I work for Metro. I'm a senior planner there, and I'm the project manager for the Riverwalk. And I wanted today to go through this draft master plan, and I apologize if there's any redundancy from the project partners presentation, but we'll try to keep it pretty concise. As you're aware, upon closure of the mill in 2011, Oregon City, Clackamas County, Metro, and the state of Oregon all came together to form the Willamette Falls Legacy Project and to secure public access to Willamette Falls. In 2012, the partners identified 4 core values in order to move the project forward and to bring it to life. Those values today and looking forward to the future have been used as a guidepost to make decisions on the project. In 2014, the graphic on the bottom is the framework master plan that was created to guide future development of the site. The Willamette Falls Riverwalk site is located on the 22-acre former Blue Heron Paper Mill property in downtown Oregon City via an easement that was donated to Metro by the private property owner over the entire property to allow design and construction of the Riverwalk. And what you see in yellow, PGE, they own the dam, and they have granted Metro an easement option to bring public access onto the dam. From the winter of 2015 to present, project staff have been involved in the Riverwalk's planning, design, and community engagement. Each white box with the orange outline at the top of the planning milestone schedule, exactly that, it represents a planning milestone. Throughout the process, we had 5 large-scale community events as well as an online community check-in. Numerous presentations and facilitated conversations were also held for local groups and organizations, and weekday tours of the site were offered during this time, and they still are offered currently. In addition to the public events, the project's outreach also included conversations with agencies and stakeholders to understand the complexities and the science of the site. We also held focus group meetings as well as meetings with state partners and the 5 tribes with past and present ties to the falls. What we heard throughout these conversations, there were a couple consistent themes. We heard that people desire interactions with nature and views of the falls, materials that respect the existing site character. We heard there was a desire for a central gathering space that supports a variety of community uses, covered areas for 4-season shade and rain protection. And lastly, we heard that people desire interpretive information about the site's history and cultural ties. We also learned that there are many factors that need to be balanced within the design and as we look at phasing and how we are moving forward with this project. And these could include things like conservation priorities, future private redevelopment plans, site accessibility, or cultural considerations. Project staff heard many ideas from the public, which informed and guided the design of the Riverwalk. The key uses that I have listed out here on the screen really drove the design for the public space, which is the Riverwalk. And they include such elements like falls viewing access, tribal use, PGE dam operations, or economic redevelopment. The design focuses on the partners' goals and the shared core values. And while we call this a Riverwalk, it really is an integrated system of gathering spaces, pathways, and not just a sidewalk. Here on the screen are some renderings of the final design. And for today's presentation, I'm not going to necessarily go into the details of the design, but you can reference the master plan for more information if you have any questions. I'm also available to answer questions as well. But the overall Riverwalk design is an aspirational plan that anticipates future funding commitments. It's anticipated that the design of the Riverwalk will be built in phases as funding becomes available. Goals for phase 1 include providing a prominent view of the falls, safe and secure interim access, habitat restoration, and building demolition that will prepare the site for future phases. The area on the screen outlined in red are indicating buildings to be demolished as part of phase 1 to help set the stage for a future phase. And the area outlined in blue is where the public viewing access location would be in the boiler plant and Mill H reject complex area. And because of the complexities of the site, at this point in the project, we have not identified interim access from Highway 99E to the viewpoint area, which is outlined in blue. That work will be further explored during the design engineering phase when we have a design build contractor under contract. Rediscover the Falls is a 501c3 nonprofit organization established in 2016 to serve as a friend-building and fundraising arm of the Willamette Falls Legacy Project. They are a group of advocates, business people, and community leaders working to return Willamette Falls to the public in a way that honors historical and cultural significance, repairs and conserves the natural habitat, and strengthens the regional community. And so that being said, here is a list of the funding commitments that we have to date, which have been contemplated in the Project Partners Intergovernmental Agreement. To date, we have approximately $19 million available to fully fund the first phase of construction for the Riverwalk. So Phil kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I'll go over it again. We released the draft master plan for public comment following a Metro Council work session in late November. That public comment period ends tomorrow. And so we're looking forward to receiving those comments and incorporating what we can in the master plan update. Last week, we gave our presentation to the project partners, and then here we are today at the City Commission work session. Next month, in early January, we'll be in front of Metro Council seeking adoption by resolution. And then, as Phil mentioned, in January, a PRAC meeting, and then early February, we'll be back in front of the City Commission. So approval of this plan is an important step to moving the project forward, and we will continue to advance the design as we get more details and refinement following approvals of this plan. So I would like to ask if any of you city commissioners or Mayor Holliday have any questions, comments, concerns related to the draft master plan. We also have a lot more information available on our website, which is shown on the bottom of your screen. So that concludes the presentation. So I'll open it up to you all.
Questions?
Thank you for your time.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I have a single question. Early in the presentation, you had a flow chart with milestones. And it said 2017-18, I believe, was engineering and drawings. Are we holding the schedule, or are we
That
slipping?
schedule is slipping. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else?
Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next up, PC 17-158, Willamette Falls Legacy Project, Riverwalk Parking, Access and Transportation Demand Management Plan. Ms. Turway?
Thank you very much. We hired Rick Williams Consulting to guide the creation of a Transportation Demand Management, or TDM, plan. The plan will help us address parking, transportation, and access to and from the Willamette Falls Legacy Project Riverwalk as it develops throughout the site. So as the Riverwalk is created, our plan is meant to address each of those stages. The plan is an appendix to the Riverwalk master plan that you just heard about. And so because of that, it will also have that same adoption process. So Metro is considering it through a resolution in January. You'll see a resolution before you in February as well. This plan is a requirement of the land use application, and so you will see it come through land use-wise through the Planning Commission when we submit for permits, hopefully later this year. Without further ado, I have Rick Williams of Rick Williams Consulting.
Thank you, Laura. Mayor and City Commissioners, my name's Rick Williams. Good evening. It's good to be back. This is our second meeting with you. I know your time is short tonight, and Christine is going to help wrap up this presentation. So I'll go through the slides, and if you do have any questions, please ask. The report is complete, and what I think we're very proud of it, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have been able to work with the community to build the plan. Again, Transportation Demand Management, or TDM, it means a lot of things, but it's really a comprehensive system of managing access to consider all forms of access, from automobiles to transit to biking to walking to all the new technologies out there, ride sharing and other ways to get around. We're seeing the environment change. We talked about this last time, that more and more cities are moving to a more broader view of access, using TDM as a key element of how they manage trips into an area. We're also noticing that the demographics of American society is changing, that more and more people are looking for and desiring non-auto modes of access and be able to link trips. I can drive one day, I can bike one season, or I can take the bus or do all three at the same time. And so more and more successful cities, we're finding there's a direct correlation between incorporating active TDM into city planning and city management and the success of cities. And it also supports everything from affordable housing to increasing the total number of trips that can enter into an area. And your area is constrained, as we talked about last time. The plan was built on community input, which what we feel really good about it. We had 3 stakeholder workshops. We met with the McLaughlin Neighborhood Association and the Citizen Involvement Committee and had an open house. And we really believe that most everything that we heard in terms of what people really wanted to see happen in the plan are incorporated in the plan. And we did it in such a way that we can phase it so that the plan evolves into your growth rather than simply implementing programs that are not reflective of the growth that might be there. It sets up a real solid foundation for the future. We talked a little bit about an inside-outside approach the last time we talked to you, which is sort of the graphic in the bottom right-hand corner, which is to first focus on what we have and leverage what we have. You have good parking system in your downtown now. You have a nascent bike program growing. We have things in place that we should be doing now. We can set up, we can do the little things first so we can set up the big infrastructure things in the future. And we can also evolve into them and have the environment set up for access when we do have to make major investments in things like parking or transit or shuttles that were set up to do it. One of the things we heard very clearly from you and from the community is this needs to be data-driven. We need to make decisions based on facts, on good data. And this plan is set up to do that and incorporates in one of the very near-term strategies is collecting data and learning more about what we have and what we don't have, what's working and what's not working, and then moving forward as a whole to implement it. The plan is also based on industry best practices for how to assess performance. And so this supports good decision making. We're using metrics that the industry uses to measure performance in an access system and tells you at what point when triggers are tripped or milestones are achieved that you then begin to make the next phase of decision making. So it starts very early with some very simple decision making, some planning and setup, and then ongoing data collection to inform the community as to when it's time to make possibly a more aggressive or a more costly decision or a more expensive decision. Real quickly, what are what we ask, because as you see, there's 24 or 25 different measures in the plan that are spread over near, mid, and long-term strategies. Really, what should we do to get started to be successful? And some of it's that mundane stuff. And the first thing was to centralize coordination of the plan. I think I've said this over and over in a lot of the community presentations. When we say transportation demand management, the really key phrase in that is management. We don't want this to be a plan. We want it to be a management system, something that's a verb. We're constantly implementing it. And so the first recommendation is to designate a lead staff here within the city who someone has to own the plan. And then put together a representative stakeholder committee, a work group, so that we engage a public-private effort to realize that we're all a part of the solution. And then an internal staff work group. Because what we found when we were out doing the interviews is there's a lot of departments within the city that have a role to play in transportation demand management, but there's no one person or department who's leading it. And so that's the first step to success. The ongoing data collection and performance measurement that we talked about. And then with the opening of the Riverwalk, to provide an interim on-site pay-to-park parking lot on the site. And also increase efforts to expand shared parking in the downtown. It's that inside strategy. What do we do on the inside with the infrastructure we have? But also by putting a surface lot in the site with the opening of the Riverwalk, we're not committing ourselves to a design. We're not committing ourselves to something that might be permanent that would affect the development that will occur in the future. So we're providing net new supply. We're maintaining flexibility for new development patterns that will occur, and we're better using the parking that we have. And then we're also, real quickly, there's just an aside, is to make sure that our current code allows us to use existing surface parking facilities for non-accessory users. And we talked about that last time, and so staff is already working on that. If we can do that within 6 months to a year, the plan begins to set itself up, and those mid and longer term strategies then make more sense. What we need to do is we need to trust the process. Success begins with commitment to the coordination of the plan. The Riverwalk in and of itself will not create or solve parking concerns in downtown. This is a rare project that will catalyze solutions and catalyze people's desire to participate in solutions. And we need to make sure that we're leveraging opportunities as they arise, as we coordinate and actively manage this plan. The big infrastructure that we heard a lot when we had the community workshops, people said, well, what's the solution? It was light rail. It was a garage. The big infrastructure is not a near-term solution. We need to really focus on those inside strategies to set up the correct economic and access environment for the outside strategies that are the big infrastructure. Private development is still going to provide parking on the site. They're going to be required to do so. The code requires that now. And I will end by saying you guys have done a marvelous job in I don't say revitalize, you're vitalizing the downtown that you have, and we believe that this plan captures that vitalization that has occurred and syncs very well with it. It's a flexible plan, it's an evolving plan, and it's a plan that will allow you to move flexibly and nimbly in the future. So with that, I'll ask Christina to come up.
Oh, I have about 2 sentences, so I can wait.
Actually, I had a question for Mr. Williams there.
Yes, sir.
The slide you just had on there, you said that the Riverwalk will not create parking concerns?
It will not create or solve the concern.
I know it won't solve it, but I think it might create it.
Okay.
I don't, I'm just
Fair question. No, it's a good point, sir.
Well, I think it's unlikely that the Riverwalk is going to create a parking concern if we have on-site parking, in the beginning.
I'm thinking about right now. If we look at what we have right now, if we do some other things on the infrastructure stuff, we will probably be able to solve that. But if you look at what we have right now, it will create parking concerns.
I really, and the nuance in that is status quo will lead to an ongoing concern. And that's why this TDM plan, I think, is so necessary, the larger coordination. So thank you, Commissioner.
Christina?
Thanks. Ms. Turway explained in the beginning, but this document really has kind of 2 paths. One as a appendix to the master plan, but second as we go through the land use process. And the requirement is a TDM strategy. How well we succeed is really how we follow the process. So there's not any individual project that will be required, but it's this commitment to a strategy to make sure we are utilizing all of our existing resources in these near-term strategies so we are set up to move forward to the mid and long-term strategies. And so that will be part of the Riverwalk Master Plan, is adopting kind of the strategy and the process to get to the projects that we all want to be built.
Questions? Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, moving on, 17652, Park Special Event and Shelter Rate Discussion, Mr. Phil Lewis. Is there another PowerPoint? Yes. Of course there is.
Try to make it quick. So thank you, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. Here today to talk with you a little bit about the special events and shelter rates that we have within our park system. Over the last few years, we've seen an uptick in the number of events requesting and scheduled within our parks, and with that, additional complexity within the sites of what is being requested of staff. With all of the additional changes, staff sat down to look at comparable cities, look at what we are charging, look at what it's costing us to maintain the sites and to properly prepare and then clean up after these events in order to provide the services that park users are expecting when they come to one of our parks. So just as a base point to start, this conversation, we will not be making any adjustments to shelter rates. Shelter rates will stay the same. The conversation, as we get further along, we'll be asking the commission to tie our fees to inflationary changes. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little sick today. I apologize for a little cloudy in the head. So we'll not be making any adjustments to the park shelter rates. but this is what our current rates are. Some of the fees that we charge for special events will be tied into what we currently charge for park shelter rates. So this is just information for that. The difference in fees, as you can see, typically is tied to what amenities are offered at each of those locations.
So what is the difference at Wesley Lynn?
Wesley Lynn is a larger shelter. It also has utility services, so water, electricity, and it's just a larger site.
Okay.
So this is the special events fee schedule. The 8.5 by 11 sheet that was attached to the staff report might be a little easier to look at. What I would like to point out is you're looking at the 2017 fees to 2018 fees. The only major differences that we see is that we're requesting a late fee to be charged. So if an event comes in less than 30 days prior to the requested date, there's an additional fee attached to that, which typically is charged for other jurisdictions. And then what we're really looking at is the special event permit fees. So depending on the size of the event and the complexity, we're finding that there's additional staff time associated, obviously, with providing events for more people. The park usage fee is the daily rate. So there, even though it looks like there is an adjustment to that, basically what we're saying is if you are renting the park for a special event, it is anticipated that you will be reserving the shelters for that day. Most of our events rent for, we have special events rent for an extended period of time, and with that they often request the shelters for those events anyway. So we would not be able to reserve those shelters for other events on that day, and so they would be paying for the shelter usage on those events. We're actually lowering the cost on a couple of items. You'll notice for portable restroom fees are actually going down, as is the drop box fees. Again, more in line with true costs, and knowing that there are some smaller events that would need, for example, a drop box, but a $140 rate might be a little much for the amount of garbage that they're actually bringing on site. So this is a comparison between similar jurisdictions in our area and what they're charging. So for the application and late fees, you'll notice in blue, Oregon City, and then in red, the late fees, application fee in blue, late fee in red. Oregon City is currently only charging an application fee. We're proposing that we jump to a late fee as well of $50. Lake Oswego's late fee currently is $200. Tigard and Westland are the two other sites that we viewed as we were putting these together. Tigard does not charge a late fee. Westland charges a more substantial application fee, which would be the same as our total fee if this moves forward. So special event permit fees. So you'll notice the current fees on the left-hand side, and then proposed fees right next to it. For each of the areas, we're fairly comparable, if not lower, than the other jurisdictions that we used as a template. The one where we are a little bit more in line is for the larger events. And again, as we host large events, the cost of providing that service does go up substantially. So this is special event usage fees. And so we have, again, as I was saying, the usage fee tied to reserving the shelters for 2 blocks of time during the day, since it would not be made available for other users. There's an additional areas fee of $90. So if they're, in addition to using the shelter and associated spaces, if they're planning on setting up obstacle courses in the park, or setting up classes and activities that would not be tied to the shelter specifically, they would pay an additional fee to reserve additional space within the park.
Question, are these for all events? Is there a price break or no fee for a nonprofit or a City-sponsored event.
We currently do not have a nonprofit rate. We do have city-sponsored events. Currently are just pay minimal application fees and deposit fees, which are refundable if the site is left in appropriate conditions.
So let's kind of run through an example, Phil, is like, you know, the Optimus Club does the Pioneer Family Festival. What are they going to be charged as a nonprofit?
So the Pioneer Family Festival is seen as a city-sponsored event, and so we currently are not charging beyond initial application fees and setup fees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Not that you have a specific interest or anything.
No, just as an example.
So this is, I'm glad you brought that up. So on the screen you'll see is a scenario of an event that might happen at one of our sites. So if we were to have a company picnic for 250 people, you'll see the price of the reservation is going to be about $250. Compared to Lake Oswego, their cost would be closer to $680. Tigard would be more than Oregon City, over $300, and Westland was more in line with what we're proposing for the Oregon City fees.
Mr. Wright, did you have a question?
Well, I was just a little confused about like parades and the car show and arts festival. They're citywide events, but they're not sponsored by the city. And I thought that the Optimus Club actually operated and ran the Pioneer Family Festival. That's not really the city doesn't sponsor that, but the city helps with all kinds of.
So I don't have the historical context, but it's my understanding that that event specifically started out as a city organized event, and then at some point transitioned to the Optimus Club running the event, and with that it was seen as a city sponsored event. It's really the only city sponsored event that we host within one of our parks.
Okay.
So the question becomes,
Yeah, the other ones.
you know, now you've started down that slippery slope. You brought it up.
No, I know.
And
That's
how-
why it's
I
good
was
to
talking
talk
to
about it and
Commissioner Shaw.
be clear.
Well, it seems to me that either it is a city-sponsored event, in other words, the city puts it on, or it's not. And if it's not, then everybody should be required to pay the same fees, whether you're a private company or a nonprofit or whoever. Unless we want to codify some things some other way, but you know, now you start down that road of, you know, the Kiwanis or who knows, the neo-Nazis want to come in and do something, and they think they're a 501c3, so they shouldn't have to pay the fees. So I think we got to be clear about it.
So you should be a city-sanctioned event would be the clearest way, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So we got.
I'm not sure what the clearest way would be. Ms. Richter?
Well, I'm not sure that city sanctioned and city sponsored is much different.
I think this is a legacy that's right or wrong, we've done over the years for the Pioneer Festival. We could certainly have that discussion. It would certainly help staff if we are going to identify a larger role. Then I think it'd be a good conversation to have, because I think staff do provide a lot of services to each of these events, with beginning with marking meters, towing vehicles if necessary, Public Works coming in, providing services, blockading streets. I don't know, how many officers did we have at First City Celebration? 6.
4 or 6, and we're going to have twice that many next year.
So, you know, there are services we're providing that we're probably not doing a very good job of recovering the cost, or just making it known that we are partnering. It might not be financially or as visible, but it would certainly help staff if we are going to sponsor these events and we're going to dedicate funds to do that.
I think we need to have that broader discussion. It's sort of like the whole deal of film permits and all that, you know, it was sort of new to us, and we hadn't really gone through the discussion to figure out all the details.
How to make it work.
I think we really need to have a broader discussion about what all the pieces are, whether it's, police protection, parking, barricades,
cleanup,
who users are. I'm not sure I want to distinguish between Benchmade Knives and the Kiwanis Club as far as, using a park facility for something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, it gets to a point, I think if the Pioneer Family Festival had to pay these fees, the festival probably wouldn't happen, because that's about all we make on that. So, because we do it on the benefit of for the community.
Yeah.
And we try to break even with what we're doing now. Now, if we have to put the fees on top of there, I don't know if we're going to be able to do that, so.
I'm not saying we should, that we should not exempt that thing. What I'm saying is I think we ought to have a broader discussion about the whole thing.
Sure.
And maybe we say, these are the 4 events that, get that exemption, or whatever the case may be. But, I think we need to line it out so that we don't have people come and go, well, hey, they got it for free, how come I can't get it for free?
Yeah, I don't know about identifying specific events, but identifying the type of event, whether it's a nonprofit or, whatever, that sort of thing,
that would
because
need to be part of
events
a
come
broader
and go.
discussion, yeah.
Yeah.
And I will say that it does, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, different municipalities do look at it differently. When I was with Portland, they did not offer a nonprofit rate because everyone was a nonprofit.
All of a sudden.
Literally, if you, if you're doing a race, an event, it's all, benefits such and such 501c3.
Right.
So it's very difficult for staff to distinguish, which is why we currently don't have a special rate for nonprofits.
Well, and the impacts are still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question was about the police, the public works, it's often overtime, they're putting in a lot of extra time in that. There's a cost to that.
Trying to build the case here, okay?
We had a conversation recently about,
Things logically.
like officers, there's the film things, and then there's, for city, there's the movies. And the good news is they've been successful. The bad news is they've been successful. So how are there certain groups or entities or sponsorships the city's doing where there's a reduced rate, or does we didn't really come up with a solution. We were just having the discussion about, is it all or nothing, or do you graduate it a little bit where there's a reduced rate and that's what's kind of hard for us to come up with, is how are you fair to everybody, but how do you still encourage people to use the parks to do these cool events that are going on?
How stacked are we in the retreat?
The retreat is not a goal setting, so it's just an update. So there will be an update from each department.
So we could take an hour and have a discussion about this at the retreat.
If that's what the commission decides to do, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fine. There at a work
Take an
session,
hour,
you know?
Huh?
Yeah.
Well, we just spent 20 minutes, so,
I think it would be helpful to understand from staff what is the at cost level, and if we're going to introduce a new rate for new nonprofits or charities or whatever it is, then they would at least cover that at cost, whereas a wedding or a business picnic would be a higher rate because they're for-profit entities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we ought to include in that discussion, so Jim was talking about movies and TV, right? So you provide some kind of service to those guys, such as?
Well, so there's crowd control, or say some of these movies will do a moving shot where we've got to shut down a street, and one time they had gone with Clackamas County reserves because they were cheaper than what we were charging. So we've got people who don't work for us shutting down streets and it was silly. So we made it now that if they're going to use sworn, if there's a requirement for law enforcement, they have to use us. And there is a different rate for reserves versus a regular officer, and there are different applications for both. But yeah, and then there are certain events, like First City, that we need to have people there.
So specifically, I was asking about the film and television stuff, so that's covered. You're getting paid for that stuff.
What they're increasingly doing is they're using private security. And for the things that they're hiring them for, they're better off. I don't blame them.
Right, they're just watching over the trailers and making sure people aren't walking into the set and that kind of stuff. Yeah. But they can't close streets or do anything else like that without our officers there.
Correct.
Okay.
It's usually traffic-related stuff that they're using us for.
And I think First City, that's one of the ones as far as the police officers are concerned, that's just something we got to eat. It's, a city thing.
I think that's true to a point.
Sort of like Halloween. That's not technically a sponsored event by anybody, but, the police go down there and hang out and do that stuff. I would leave that up to the chief's discretion.
I think too that it's more of a greater discussion, but events create livability, and the costs then are a part of being a city. We're all part of the city. We all want to enjoy the events, and sometimes there's just cost to that. So
we can have that discussion in January. So did we totally derail your presentation?
A little bit.
No, I think it's great so far.
Yeah, so the last thing, just cleaning and damage deposit fees, which we can already went over. These are refundable, assuming everyone cleans up after themselves, don't leave things a mess. Typically we see like vehicles driving through the park, creating big ruts or breaking irrigation lines, or just leaving all of their garbage all over the site.
Just a question, why is there a difference in the damage and deposit fees for alcohol and without alcohol?
There's more possibility for damage to occur with alcohol. And so to make sure we at least have a little bit of more funds that are recoupable.
All right.
And so the request, at upcoming city commission meeting, we would be coming forward with a resolution that would set fees. It would include as exhibits the special event fee schedule, as well as the shelter reservation fees tied to inflation. Request of staff would be that the commission gives the city manager the ability to set rates for any new shelters, as long as it is within comparable amenities that are being provided. So as we bring on Glen Oak Park, for example, or Filbert Run, we would not need to come back to get approval for charging the same rate that we would charge for a similar sized shelter at one of our parks.
I have a couple questions. One is, if someone is putting in a reservation, are they typically just for a section of the park, and therefore some remainder of the park might be open to the public?
Depends on the event, and typically the reservation requests that we receive that would take up a larger portion of the site are open to the general public. Okay. So like the Pioneer Festival would be an example where the site is open for folks to walk around and use the site. Oftentimes they'll use a section of the park, so which might be next to one of the shelters or next to a specific area of the park. We don't receive too many where they ask for a full close down of one of our park facilities.
Okay. And the second is just more of a comment. If we're seeing a lot of demand for park shelters, maybe we should be building more of them, and you alluded to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're looking at, again, both of those site locations having shelters available with them. Okay. And so the request of staff would be to attempt to get a resolution through as soon as possible. We do have reservations for special events typically start off around the first of the year. And so we'd like to come forward sooner than later with a resolution that would be adopted by the commission in order to allow us to recoup some of these costs that we're seeing. If not, we will probably begin renting using the previous year's numbers, which again would not allow us to recoup the fees that we're paying for the true cost of the reservations.
So it seemed to me that you could come back with a resolution for this fee schedule and include some language that we're going to have additional discussions and that could change moving forward.
I can.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think setting fees is a fairly easy task. I think differentiating who pays and what rates is a whole other problem.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Question?
Nice job on the manual. That was great.
Oh, thank you. Jenny King and Jonathan Waverly worked really hard on that
Yeah.
to get it all buttoned up. And if you saw the previous manual compared to this one, is a lot more clear and easier to use for guests that are looking to reserve our facilities.
So are the reservations available online?
Reservations are currently not available online. Special events are a little bit of a different animal, but we are moving towards a online reservation system for typical shelter rentals.
Okay.
So one thing I didn't see in the manual was a park-by-park map and description that says this picnic shelter has a capacity for 50 people, or some of those details that an event planner would need to know.
Yeah.
So that may be a future addition that you could consider.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Anything else? Okay, thanks, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you.
Moving on, Oregon City Municipal Code Review, lot averaging subdivisions, Ms. Turway.
Thank you very much. So we're here tonight to talk about lot averaging, which is a requirement in the Oregon City Municipal Code. It's a provision that allows subdivisions, I'll bring up the code in just a moment, but it's a provision that allows subdivisions to have lots that are slightly below the minimum lot size, provided the average of all the lots in general meets the minimum lot size. Here's the exact language. We've heard a lot about this recently. In fact, the commission has 2 items before you that are utilizing this. And so as much as possible, I want to encourage us not to talk about those items and to just stick to the general concept of lot averaging. But we're here because this year we've heard a lot of concern regarding this standard. And we'll go through what the concerns are, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. This presentation, I just want to go through the history, what the lot averaging standard is, how it's applied, and then ask for some direction from the City Commission on what you would like me to do for the next steps. So with this standard, it's a standard that is a mathematical standard. You figure out your lot averages, and then that's it. There's no discretion in it. It's not applied in some cases or in others. It's available across the board in a very clear and objective way. So it includes lots that can be 20% less than the minimum lot size. So for example, if you have a subdivision in the R10 zoning designation, its minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet. So you can get lot sizes that are 8,000 square feet mixed in with this subdivision up to 8,000 square feet. So you'll see variations on that, provided the math works out as a whole. We've seen some subdivisions that have like one big lot and lots of smaller lots, so we've seen how that math works out throughout this year. The calculation of lot area, it doesn't include tracts, which are like stormwater ponds. It doesn't include tracts that don't allow a home to be there. So it is only included in that mathematical calculation if you could put a house on it. So it doesn't include generally right-of-way. It doesn't include...
but it does include utility easements.
Yeah, and actually that's a good segue. There's 2 things to figure out with lot averaging. One is to figure out how much density you can get within a subdivision, and then how you apply that density is lot averaging. So first is, we have a definition of net developable area. So it says, you take your land and you subtract out streets and you subtract out slopes and all these other things. And then you divide that by, in this case, if our example was 10,000 square feet, divided by 10,000 square feet, and that'll tell us how many units you can have. So that would be your density. And then lot averaging is how you apply that density. So this provision, we'll talk about it in just a moment, but one of the flexible points that it allows is when development occurs, there's a lot of standards you have to meet, and you layer all these standards on. And sometimes it doesn't fit in the perfect world that we have now. So if you want street connections, there are places where there's not enough space to have a bigger lot. That will be 10,000 square feet, but maybe you have enough space for a 9,500 square foot lot. And so lot averaging helps you apply the density that you have already calculated through a different provision to the subdivision map when you apply it. I'll give you some examples, it shows a little bit differently. But I just want to make a distinguishing factor that you figure out what your density is separate than how your lot averaging works. So in other words, lot averaging doesn't allow you more lots than you would get in the zoning designation. You get the same number, it's just some of them are smaller sizes. When you apply them, you may be able to fit one more in to use the full capacity of the zoning designation because you have a constrained area, but you can't have more. If you have a 100,000 square foot piece of property and it's an R10, you get 10 lots, and that's it. Lot averaging won't give you 11 lots. You still only get 10 lots. When you go to do your subdivision layout, maybe there's a constraint, a physical constraint, and you can only fit in 9 lots, but lot averaging may help you with a little pocket of an area to fit in your 10th, but you'll never get 11. You'll always get your zoning maximum. Bit confusing, I'll show you some examples. So why was this adopted? We'll go through some of the hearings a little bit later, but primarily it's because it allows flexibility. So what we talked about is we have an urban growth boundary, and we wanted to make sure that we get in those requirements within our city. If not, we expand, and we keep expanding. So it was to allow flexibility for people to develop. And it was to provide certainty with that. We have this clear and objective standards. It doesn't say you can have a lot that's smaller than 10,000 square feet. In these cases, it says, here's the math, you make the math work, and it works. Also, it provides a variety of slightly more housing choices. So maybe you have a slightly smaller lot, which is maybe a smaller house, and maybe that house is slightly more affordable than the bigger lot. So it encourages more housing options, which is more housing affordability, and it maybe increases that capacity just a little bit. In the example of where we had the 10 lots, but you couldn't squeeze one in because of a street connection or something, or stream, but you could fit in like a 9,500 square foot lot. In that case, you would get a net difference of slightly more housing capacity. But it, in general, would have very little effect on density as a whole. It also allows us to balance these constraints. We want street connections. We want minimum lot sizes. We want minimum lot widths. We want to protect the streams and the slopes. And putting all those together has been a challenge. And back when we adopted this in 2003 or 2004 originally, we were seeing development at the fringes like crazy. So, we were getting properties annexing, we were getting large lot subdivisions, and this provision was helpful to allow infill development within the city and not just at the fringes. So how do you grow smart, and how do you allow flexibility so people can have development throughout the city and not just on those outer rings. It allows us to utilize infrastructure efficiently because we're building to our capacity that's allowed by the zoning designation. Back then, we also had a lot of infrastructure and easements. So sidewalks and street trees, because the space was so constrained, they were always in easements, like always in easements. Now, sometimes they happen in easements, but primarily we like to keep them in the right of way. But back then, everything was so spatially constrained, trying to put these 5-lot subdivisions in these small properties, that we had to see a lot of infrastructure go into easements. Also, there was the timing on this. We were creating the comprehensive plan. We did this massive change to all of our zoning designations we created these mixed-use zones, upzoned a lot of property, and there's a feeling that all of the lands within the same comprehensive plan designation are compatible. So, the reduction that you would get from lot averaging is fine because, our 6 and our 10, I mean, they're compatible. They're in the same comprehensive plan designation of low-density residential. And then also, there is a desire to reduce barriers to housing and provide more opportunity for housing as well. So I am very sorry for anyone who tried to open the attachment that was, how many, 500 pages or something? And because it probably took you a while to open. We went through as much as I could find. I pulled boxes of applications and I pulled minutes and packets and put them together. There was a couple that I missed online. So I have them, and my apologies for that. But I pulled that many number of meetings. And lot averaging specifically really wasn't talked about very much at all. Again, it was as part of this larger package. It was in there. It's not explicit in a lot of the memos. No, I mean, it's pretty silent. The most that it's talked about in a hearing is from here to here on this page from a joint work session between Planning Commission and City Commission on February 11, 2004. That's about it. It was adopted in 2004 in the summer, and then we went back and amended the language a little bit in December of that year, and then we also made an amendment in mid-2009. So in 2004, it was pretty much the same flavor it is now, except for the lot averaging only allowed a reduction of 10%. When we made the amendment in later that year, 6 months later, we made some minor tweaks, but it was still at 10%. It was back in 2009, again, we did this large package of improvements, and we increased the amount that you could reduce your lot from 10 to 20%.
And what was the reasoning behind that? Or
It's not really explained very much, but to add flexibility and everything that we've been talking about, but it wasn't explicitly described in a lot of in any of the materials. In the conversation in the work session, it says, does this provide, there's this conversation between some city commissioners, planning commissioners, and staff, and it basically, they're asking, does it provide enough flexibility? And staff says, yeah, I think 10 does. And that's about the extent of the conversation. Oh, sorry. It's you. So I want to run through a couple of examples real quick. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I pulled the first subdivision of every year since 2010 so we can see how it's applied. And so this is I'm expecting you to read it, but I'm going to show you the sizes. So you can look at the images of the lots. This one utilizes lot averaging. This one utilizes lot averaging, also lot averaging, more lot averaging, lot averaging here. No lot averaging on this one. No lot averaging on this one. Lot averaging, lot averaging, lot averaging. It's pretty much, people use it all the time. It's used often, maybe not to the extent where there is such few huge lots and lots of smaller lots. I won't talk about anything in specific, but in general, it has been used a lot, but not in that particular way.
Question, of the examples that you looked at, were the majority of them like a 10% variance, or were they all using the 20%?
It varies. It varies. Most of them did use it, but not for all the lots. Some developers maybe wanted higher lots and maybe the small lot, or otherwise other developers would average it through all the lots so they were all slightly small. So I think it depends on how that developer works. Okay. The other thing is, back in the day, we also had a lot of variances to lot sizes. After we made this change, you noticed a sharp decrease in variances to Planning Commission.
So, Laura,
Yeah.
Do you have any input from your department on these subdivisions? Or does the subdivision designer come in and say, here's our subdivision, and you rubber stamp it and out it goes? Or do you suggest, you've got some R6s over here, some R10s over here. Should we make some changes here? Are you allowed to do that at all, or what?
We don't. We stick by those standards. You meet the standards, you're approved. If there's one you don't meet, you're not. So we don't do that layer of negotiation. It's, here's how lot averaging works, here's the minimum lot size, go forth and do your plan. We'll review it in a public process. So we don't do that negotiation now.
You just check their work.
Except with regard to infrastructure, like road connectivity, they make sure all the roads meet at 90 degrees, and sometimes that affects the lot locations.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, our staff reports are at least 50 pages in a subdivision.
But every subdivision's going to go through the planning commission anyway, right?
No, subdivisions are a type 2 staff level, and this is why, is because we don't have a lot of discretion. I mean, very few pieces of it are discretionary.
Okay.
And so that was also the intent of why we made these standards like they are, is because they're clear and objective. They provide certainty for neighbors, certainty for developers, certainty for staff. So we haven't seen a lot of concern.
One more question. So let's say the lot, let's say it's 10-acre lot, and about 20% of it is steep slopes and water, like a stream buffer. Is that cut out of what's available for development, and then the remainder of it is lot averaged?
Yeah, so when you do your density calculation, you take out explicitly those slope areas and those stream areas, and then you figure out what's left. And the streets, figure out what's left, and that'll give you a number. And then you can apply that number of dwelling units to your subdivision. When you do lot averaging, though, then you take all the lots with houses on it and then add them together and divide it to get your average. So it does not get included in density, no.
I think there's a bit of a fallacy in the calculation. The statement is made that lot averaging does not include lots that cannot accommodate homes. Yet you can upsize a lot in a 10,000 square foot division and put another 10 with it because you can't do anything with it. You can't build a house on it. So a guy gets a 20,000 square foot lot. Now I've got 10,000 square feet that I can divide among the remaining homes. So if I take that and divide it, that in fact, instead of getting say 10 homes or 8 homes, I get 11 to 14 homes.
You would have to modify the subdivision and show that you still average the 10,000 for the full subdivision, so you couldn't get more. But that's a good point.
I think you do. I mean, and the other thing I want to say is I read through these things and I couldn't, because of what you're quoting and because of the difficulty in extracting from 214 pages that downloads in 11 minutes, and I couldn't find it, and not highlighted and not excerpted, and we had that conversation. We won't revisit it. I'm not totally comfortable with decisions tonight, but I do feel the things I did see, and I sent to Tony, and I'm sure he sent to you, is and the original commission agreed to tweak this as needed. And I feel there's still that, and I made this argument before, I think there is an intent, and I do not want to work with developers. I want to. So I understand when there's a certain amount of homes that aren't going to make that whatever the R is, R8, R10. And there's some finite number, but essentially, I think it's currently as written, it's ripe for abuse because it allows you to essentially take what is in name an 8,000 square feet and effectively make it a 6,400 square foot subdivision.
But I think part of the discussion is there really a difference between
yes, there is.
In the real scheme of things, a 6,000 foot lot, an 8,000 square foot lot, and a 10,000 square foot lot?
There's a huge difference among those three.
How?
In terms of what you can do with it, livability, living with setbacks.
My question is, if we're building a brand new subdivision, okay, and so a house on a 6,000 square foot lot's going to be, who knows, $350,000. And an 8,000 square foot lot, maybe it's going to be $400,000, and maybe it's going to be another 50 or 60 or $100,000 for the, but the income ranges of those families are not going to be substantially disparate to change the livability of that neighborhood.
That neighborhood as it's designed, but as it was originally perceived and conceived, if it was an R10 and got a waiver to R8 and then they effectively became 6,400, that is a huge difference. And there's a huge difference for the adjoining homes. And I don't know what you do on your property. I'm an 8,000 R8, and you know, I've struggled with setbacks, as we well know. And you know, I mean, you can 10,000 square feet, you can put a shop on it. 8,000 square feet, you can have some comfortable garden sheds, maybe some other buildings. 6,000 square feet and maintaining your setbacks is a very challenging thing. So, I mean, there's a difference. And then the impact, you know, let's not forget the impact, and maybe Laura and I disagree, but when I do the math and I get that extra, when I start taking that unbuildable territory and I put it into a lot, I can get a whole bunch more out of any piece of land. So
But I thought unbuildable stuff isn't included in the calculation.
It is once you include it with a lot. If you take a 10,000 square foot lot and you include 10,000 square feet additional of unbuildable, that becomes a 20,000 square foot lot that is included in the calculation. Is that not correct?
You just can't get more dwelling units than the zoning allows. So,
But what we've seen up here is that zoning changes occur concurrently with some other applications. So the zone change goes down, the number of homes goes up.
so if it's a 100,000 square foot lot and it's zoned R10, you will never get more than 10 units.
I'll do the math and I'll see if that works out, but I think.
So I think what you're trying to say is that, and I concur with you, that, that especially utility easements should not be included in the calculation. Even if they're used for yards, that space that somebody's using for a yard shouldn't be allowed to be used in the calculation as far as lot averaging is concerned.
But
it is.
Yeah, the utility easements are.
They are.
I think that's what you're seeing here is that the BPA easement was so wide.
We're not talking about anything specific, Mr. Conkle.
Not on the property,
Just
not
in
on this
case you
one.
came-
Just
Oh,
in general,
it was the example I showed
going
you.
through Oregon City,
Right here,
the
there you go.
BPA easement can be very wide sometimes.
So such as this.
Which really got to this being able to, you know, have a really large single lot that then allows you to average 85% of the other
So what I'm saying is anything inside this, even though they can build a house over here at 24, they wouldn't be able to use this land as space to utilize for lot averaging.
They can now, but you're saying.
They can now. Well, I'm
Yeah.
saying we should take
If
that
we-
out.
If you're saying if you can't build a house on it, you can't use it. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, right now, you can still build a house on this little corner, okay?
Okay.
But all this land, you can't build anything on.
Right.
Because it's part of the utility easement. I'm saying we shouldn't allow that to be used in lot averaging. Only the space that's outside of the utility easements.
Do you want to talk about a couple of things?
Yeah, so there were a lot of concerns about lot averaging. They're on the screen. You guys are very well familiar with a lot of them, but it relates to impacts. I do want Carrie to speak for a second on, so there's two slides. One, concerns about the lot averaging, and then the other one is concerns about how we move forward through this process and things that we should be thinking about legally.
Can we go back to the last slide, this one? So you said earlier that you've been hearing a lot of concerns. Is that just really recently, or since 2009, has it just not been an issue until just recently, or what has it been over the last several years? As far as
Almost
concerns?
nothing until recently.
Okay.
Maybe one neighbor, one subdivision, maybe once a year, maybe less than that.
Okay,
but
that tells me a
Well,
lot.
let me qualify that answer because I want to ask.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen it applied to the extent that we may see it applied as allowed?
I think that it's a newer trend to have a couple really big lots and lots of and using the lot averaging for such a high portion to such a large degree and balancing it with so few large.
So prior to the near future, which we're trying to anticipate.
Probably like this year.
Yeah, this year would be a good choice.
Yeah.
We had never seen development such that it changed the whole complexion. If you were to say, I've got 100 homes, it's an 8,000 square foot lot, I've got 120 homes, and now I've got that same deal with lot averaging and the ability to, to bring down a lot size by 20%, we get a lot of homes. And we change the complexion and
I think you're missing the point.
Oh, I don't. Go ahead.
I do. When you're using lot averaging, you don't get any additional dwelling units.
I guess what could happen?
Just change the size of the ground that they're sitting on.
Right. I guess what could happen, right, is that you've got R10. You're allowed 4.4 units per acre. That's it. That is the maximum you are allowed. So let's just say you have 10,000, you have 10 lots, okay? You can never have an 11 lot, no matter how you do lot averaging. It is not allowed by code. But what could happen is, like Laura was trying to explain earlier, because of where we have to put a street in or because of an existing easement, without the lot averaging, maybe they could only get 8 lots. But with the lot averaging, they could get 9. Mm-hmm. They could, but it's still under the 10 that they're allowed by code. So I think every one of these is so unique, and it really is contingent upon easements, street locations, lot layout, how the parent lot is situated. Some of them are squares, rectangles, triangle. I mean, we see all kinds of crazy stuff that comes in. So I guess I would just say that the code sets the maximum number of units allowed. It is very rare that you can build the total maximum units because it just never works out. By the time you put a storm tract in, corner easements, because the lots need to be bigger on the corners, where streets need to go, dead ends. But it is conceivable that if we just said none of them can be lower than R10, you could maybe only get 8. With lot averaging, you could get 9. But you could never get 11 if 10 were the maximum. Even if you mathematically could, we wouldn't allow it because that exceeds the density allowed on the property. So I get where yours coming from in terms of, if we would have said no lot averaging, everyone's got to be 8,000 square feet, they would not have been able to build as many lots as they proposed. But because of that, they did get to put more lots in, but it was still lower than the maximum that they were allowed.
In the hypothetical situation.
In a hypothetical situation, yep, that's what we see, is the lot averaging helps you get one more in a tight corner or next to a storm track, when, realistically, if you didn't have lot averaging, you might have lost 1 lot.
And I think that was the intent of it, Tony. I have no argument with that as you stated the example in an application. What I have is when you change the entire complexion of a subdivision. Mm-hmm. I mean, I want the builder that if he's got 10,000 R10s and he's got 1 lot that's 8,500, or he's got some low percentage of it, please do, don't let it sit there vacant. And, I'd like to see some other considerations about transitional areas between, and I'm sure the mayor probably totally disagrees with this, but if people are sitting there with a 10,000 square foot lot, maybe the first ones in this development are 10, and then they step down to 8 and 6. And I think it's a very nice transition. So I think there's a number of things in there that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do feel that it merits some review. As the original people that sculpted this thing said, we should go back and tweak it.
So let's finish the presentation.
Carrie?
Quickly, I wanted to point out that the city has an obligation to provide housing based on its population projected growth. That's sort of the city's overall obligation under the statewide planning goals. And the city's housing inventory is from 2004, and it's not accurate anymore. So when we're talking about lot averaging, as Tony explained, we eliminate lot averaging, we could result in less lots. And that reduces our overall amount of housing provided. I understand we're talking about 1 or 2 lots in every subdivision, which may be insignificant, and maybe we're just talking about tweaking the edges, excluding easement area from the buildable area, or providing that progression that Commissioner O'Donnell was talking about. But what concerns me is that we have an obligation to provide housing based on our need, and we don't have an updated need. And so when we start tinkering, when we don't have the facts about what it is exactly we need, I get a little worried, particularly with the fair housing guarantees for providing housing for everybody. So that's my point on that slide.
And I believe there's additional obligations to the community beside that, and I understand that.
We're working with Clackamas County right now to, we're looking at doing a county-wide housing inventory, and so we're part of that. And so this week, the applications were due to get a consultant on board, so it's sifting through that, picking one. So we are a part of that, and so we do look forward to updating our housing inventory from 2002 soon.
So did we make a decision about that, Tony, or did you make that call on your own?
The housing inventory?
Yeah, did we?
It did not go to the commission. Actually, it's a really good deal. I don't know what the total fee is, but for about $7,000, we can get a housing inventory, and we were trying to get a $100,000 grant for housing inventory and lost. We kind of talked about it a little bit when we got the equitable housing grant, because that's who originally wanted.
I think once we saw the price.
Yeah, all right.
It wasn't.
That's fine.
Screaming deal.
So I have 2 points.
Hold on, let's,
sure.
Are we done with the presentation?
This one, and then the options left. So potential options, they're listed. Actually, Commissioner O'Donnell perfectly listed all of them. So this is just my suggestions off what I've heard. Obviously, it's the commission, whatever code you want to do, we can implement. It's your code. So you can limit the number of lots that can be below the minimum lot size, amend the square footage reduction. So if you want to go back from 20 to 10, limiting lots, maybe only half the lots can utilize the reduction. Look at those perimeter lots on a subdivision. Maybe they can't have lot averaging, or remove it altogether. If you remove it altogether, we have to mail notice to everyone in the UGB. Then last one is, what would you like me to do?
Okay, Commissioner Ide?
Well, because this hasn't been a huge issue over the years, and it has just come up recently, which, I can honor that too. And because, when I look at our goals over here, I don't see a goal or an objective, other than maybe I might be able to put it under livability, but we don't have any goals or objectives that say, let's do a big code revision here. Because, in your staff report, it explained about what the process is to go through a whole code revision. It's a big public process. It's very costly, in lots of ways. And so I guess I would be in favor of, I'm excited about the housing inventory. I think that's great, because I think we should wait until we get that done. And then in the next biennium, in our goal setting retreat for early 2019, we should assign some funds to do a code revision, so that we can begin planning and looking at it, but delay it until after the housing inventory is done, and then have that discussion in January of 19.
And we are looking at code revisions with our equitable housing project, so you could fit it under
Combine
that.
them.
But again, it's going to be before the housing inventory, probably.
When do you anticipate the housing inventory to be done?
I'm not exactly sure on the timeline. Just that we're starting, and these things take a while.
Yeah.
So.
Commissioner Shaw?
Well, since this has just kind of come about here recently, I don't have a problem with continuing with the direction we have until we get our inventory analysis back and see what we need, and then we can apply that to something new that we maybe will do. So that's kind of right.
The problem with continuing in the direction we're going, And the timeline on that is such that we've never seen it applied to this extent where where entire subdivisions change the character. And, my position, of course, which is probably on the losing end, is I'd like an interim emergency ordinance, and I would favor bullets 2, 3, and 4 that Laura put up in the preceding slide. And I think in some of those, in fact, amending the square footage reduction allowed was part of the founding code that was passed and since changed. I think that the commission before did not stay true to its cause where they said, we'll go back and we'll review it. They may have reviewed it shortly after it was passed, but did they review it? Review should be ongoing. Did they review it after a subdivision was formed? Did you ever see anything of this magnitude, the potential of anything for this magnitude where the entire complexion of a development was changed? So, I'll maintain that position, win, lose, or draw. But I think there's a conception that smaller lots are more desirable. But I think there's a number of other considerations besides that, including livability and value and things like that. So that's my statement. I feel strongly about it, and that's where I'll leave it.
Commissioner Mingerborg, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I'd like to see added to this list of potential options what we talked about in terms of eliminating floodplain, riparian areas, and steep slopes from the base land. I think that would address part of the issue.
Aren't those already out, Laura?
It's not on your list?
For density, they don't get included. If they're on a lot, then they might find their way into lot averaging if they're not in a separate tract.
See, and that's the situation I'm describing.
So you could include that in the same thing as utility easements. None of those things should be considered for the purposes of lot averaging, is what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable.
And then the other thing is, originally it was R10, and then it got expanded to R20, or it got, originally you could decrease it by 10%, and then it got changed 6 months later to 20%. Was that a minor code amendment, or was that a major, let the world know, huge event?
Yeah.
In other words, could we flip it back in a minor, easy-to-do thing?
You would want to do the same legislative process no matter what your changes. Yeah, it was originally in 2004, that 10%, and then in 2009 we increased it to 20%. But
And was that through a legislative process?
But it was through, again, another huge package. So it was just a ton of changes all at once.
Mr. Shaw?
So is this whole thing a city commission thing, or should it be a planning commission thing?
You can push it back to the planning commission to noodle on and give you a recommendation.
I'm just wondering if are we as, I don't.
I see it as a city commission thing.
I do too, I think.
All right, I just curious.
So let me offer can you go back to that other slide again? Let me offer a possible solution here. So why don't we get staff to come back to us in January, if there's enough time to do that, to take these three plus the utility riparian area, unbuildable areas that wouldn't be able to be utilized as far as lot averaging, and bring us back a change that we could talk about. Because eventually, we're still going to have to send it back to the planning commission, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we come up with what we want, and then we got to send it to the planning commission. They got to have hearings again, blah, blah, blah. So I agree with you. I think some things about that are not good. I don't think removing it is a solution.
Or do I, Mayor?
Okay. So is everybody comfortable with that? I know it's going to cost a little bit. But
Yeah, and it's not something that's, we didn't identify those things in our goals, even though, of course, we didn't know. But I don't see it as an emergency because it's only been just recent concerns that have been brought up since 2009. So
okay.
that's why I'm not
And I
supportive of
hear what
that.
you're saying, but we also have to realize that from 2007 to about 2012, almost nothing was being built. So we're just now in the forefront of that whole, building craze again, and it's going to continue on as we add the lands out Beaver Creek and other places. And it's well known enough now that it could easily translate into other pitchforks and, sorts of things coming forward. So, Laura, is this something that's going to take hundreds of hours of staff time, or can this get done in a reasonable amount?
Can I try for January or February
That's
if I
fine.
need to?
I think
Okay.
that's fine.
And what's the housing inventory? I mean, you would need to have that complete, right, in order to.
That's the risk you're running.
Yeah.
When you amend the code.
The risk is the more changes we make without data about what we need and what effect it will have, we're going to have to notify Department of Land Conservation and Development of a code change. Those notices go to lots of housing watchdog groups that bring Fair Housing Act claims against cities. One happened in Happy Valley last year. Not for a removal of a lot averaging standard, but with regard to a plan amendment for another thing. So I just have to make you aware. I mean, will eliminating the utility, eliminating the utilities from the lot averaging provisions affect the overall buildable lands in the city? Probably not. But the further down this road you go, when we don't know what our housing needs are, there's greater risk.
But at the end of the day, our 10 is still our 10, and our 8 is still our 8, and our 6 is still our 6.
But if you eliminate the lot averaging and folks can't get.
But we're not eliminating the lot averaging, we're just tweaking it a little bit. And I understand that you have to give us the legal warnings.
Well, I just don't see the rush. I don't see why we're in such a hurry. I mean, I support what Commissioner O'Donnell is bringing up and Commissioner Mangerbug, but I just don't see that we need to hurry. I would much rather have the housing inventory in place.
Well, I think the housing inventory is going to take probably at least a year, I would guess. Yeah. That's not something that you're going to do in a month or two. I mean,
No.
we discussed it at the C4 retreat for 3 hours. So, if it took us that long to just talk about it, imagine how long it's going to take to actually do it.
Oh, I agree. I'm sure.
And,
you don't want to hurry that.
We have a group of citizens who could use some answers on this subject.
I want to do it right. I don't want to.
I think we let staff go back with those 4 bullets and bring us back something that we can talk about. And then we go through the rest of the system. It goes to the Planning Commission and let those people talk about it for 4 meetings.
Is there consensus for that?
So question to Ms. Troway. Are we at a point where developing Oregon City is just going to be more and more challenging because a lot of the great flat easy sites are developed, and now we're getting into the hard stuff that has terrain, that has topography, that has issues with it, and therefore lot averaging is going to be more and more needed if you're going to do things with the property?
I think so, because we either have infill sites that have a lot of physical constraints, or we have sites with slopes or streams. On the outer fringes, the further out we go, the more we're seeing areas that are much harder to serve, a lot more physical problems and slopes and things like that. In some of the concept plans, there are some properties that are nice and flat that upon annexation could develop relatively easily, but I tell you, we haven't had a land division that I can think of. I don't know if we've had a subdivision in a while without some environmental problem, constraint, or to address.
So this is, having flexibility is going to become more and more important.
As long as it's not abused.
The question is how much flexibility.
Right, there it is.
So I think I think you have enough sense of where.
I think we understand the issues and what we're trying to address.
Right. So come back to us with something reasonable in February or March.
Is there consensus for that?
What?
Is there consensus for that?
Now we're going to March. Good one. You picked up
Is there
on it.
consensus?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the last thing we have is fee waivers for neighborhood association appeals, and I'm going to take this off, at least from the beginning. So do you have a presentation on this, Mr. Conkle?
My presentation includes referencing 1750-190C5, which talks about neighborhood associations and how they are able to get a free appeal should the general membership of board approve the request. And then, I had Community Development Director Turway go back, and we pulled total number of appeals since 2003. Providing the stats, there were 48 appeals, 11 within by neighborhood associations. All of them were within the neighborhood boundary. All of them received except for one. In 2004, there was one appeal that was not in the boundary, and of those, they received the fee waiver, except for recently in 2017. So just trying to provide some data around what we're seeing in terms of appeals to the city.
The reason I asked to bring this forward is because it seems to me that if a neighborhood wants to appeal a project, that we should only give them the free appeal if it's in the boundaries of their neighborhood association. That disallows someone, an activist, from neighborhood shopping until he finds a neighborhood that is willing to support a request to appeal a project. So any neighborhood would still have the ability to bring their appeal forward for free from the Planning Commission to the City Commission. You just couldn't shop a project around to say there's something going on in Rivercrest and somebody doesn't like it and they can't get the Rivercrest Neighborhood Association to ask for the appeal, so they shop at the Gaffney Lane or South End until they find a neighborhood association that's willing to do it. And we've recently had an example of that. So I realize it's not, a huge glaring problem, but as litigious as people have been with the city as of late, I think it's one way to help prevent some of that from happening. So with that, I'll allow the discussion.
I just want to add two things real quick. One, the neighborhood association would have to have standing, so they would have had to have participated in order to appeal. So I think that's probably why we don't see a lot of this, is if it's in South End, Park Place would have had to have participated in order of been able to even be able to appeal. And I guess this
would they have to participate officially, or is it just someone who belongs to the Park Place Neighborhood Association?
The neighborhood association would have to have standing as the neighborhood association. So if I live in Park Place, I'm not representing the Park Place Neighborhood Association just because I live there.
But if you go and testify, that gives you standing.
As an individual, not as the neighborhood association, unless the neighborhood association has authorized me to go speak on their behalf. So usually that would be a letter submitted by the board. They're all set up a little bit differently, but there has to be some official action taken by the neighborhood association, not just a resident within the neighborhood association.
Prior to the appeal request. Prior to the decision.
Prior to the closing of the public record for the original decision. So if it's
that's new information to me.
I'm sorry. Tried to include it in, but okay. And then the second thing to just consider is that sometimes we make decisions that do impact neighborhoods, even though it may not be in their neighborhood association. They could be on the boundary of a big development. It could be a legislative action, which is citywide, but the change might not. So there's just a lot of nuances to this. So I this is a policy decision for you, but.
I guess I could support you in what you said. Here's how I feel about it. I'm looking at the data. I guess if the supposition is that the process has been abused or that it's been applied widely outside of neighborhood associations, and I look at this data chart and I look at who's taken advantage of the waiver of fees, I just don't see it. I mean, I see that most of these were within the neighborhood association boundary. Those that say not applicable are because they weren't appealed by neighborhood associations. And McLaughlin has 3 that were in the neighborhood association boundary, and they still chose not to use the fee waiver. So my feeling is, and I'm open, I'll discuss anything, and I'm willing to discuss this. I think we're all citizens of Oregon City. I particularly can't stand the thought of, I can't do this because it's 32 feet across the street, and I'm going to look at it every day. I think we all live here. I think if we're talking about something like as major as Beaver Creek in 213 or anything, I think that I just don't see the abuses. And the way you phrased it, it has to be a vote of the neighborhood association, members of it, not, you can't stack the deck, you can't bring people in and do it. It's got to be those people that are in it. So I would have difficulty changing the current situation.
With standing, that was my question too. I wasn't sure about that. So, you know, if someone just went to another neighborhoods association meeting and spoke at it, you know, got up and spoke to whatever their issue was, that perhaps it might affect them in their neighborhood and they just wanted it to become part of that neighborhood association's minutes, that they were opposed to it, does that give them standing? Can you repeat that again? Exactly what would give them standing? Would it have to be a vote
As far as a voting member?
of the other
let Carrie
neighborhood?
answer that question.
Yeah.
Okay. Standing is participation before the planning commission. Okay, so before you're going to appeal, you have to have standing at the planning commission. That means that a person has to have submitted testimony on behalf of that neighborhood association for that neighborhood association to have standing and then appeal. So under the forum shopping scenario, I would have to go to the neighborhood association meeting before the planning commission finishes its review, convince that neighborhood association to submit testimony before the planning commission. Then that neighborhood association would have standing and could then be convinced or could be concerned and could appeal.
Okay, so hold on. So to prevent any further discussion, I think that answered my major concern, and I'm willing to withdraw the proposal unless somebody wants to take it further.
No.
No,
Okay.
I'm not that guy.
Mr. Manager, you have your report?
I have nothing else for tonight. Thank you.
Then we're adjourned.
Jeez.